So how did I become a POW? I was a combat infantry rifleman, and I went into combat early December 1944, participated in recon and combat patrols. I pulled plenty of outpost duty alone in the pitch blackness of the night in freezing weather, as this was one of the coldest winters in Europe in over 50 years. Our schedule was 2 hours on, 4 off, 24/7. You ate and slept whenever you had a chance. Middle of December, after having coming off a patrol, I was sleeping in my dirt shelf in our dugout, and at about 5:30 in the morning, a continuous artillery barrage hit us for about an hour with every type of artillery that the Germans could assemble. The ground shook from the heavy shells exploding all around us, and I was thrown out of my sleeping shelf. We made our way to our assigned foxholes, and during this barrage, many men were hit by shrapnel from tree bursts as we awaited for infantry and tank attacks. I learned years later that over 250,000 Germans, consisting of 3 armies, hit us that morning, concentrating their efforts on our weakly held positions. What they didn't expect was the tenacity and courage of American infantry, and my unit in particular. Even though surrounded for 3 days, we fought until our food and ammunition was exhausted. The German plan was to wipe us out in the first 12 hours. Our stand disrupted their timetable and allowed American reserves to be rushed into the battle, and eventually over 1 million men fought in what is now known as the Battle of the Bulge. The U.S. suffered 78,000 killed, wounded, or missing in that battle. In my case, on that 3rd day, my foxhole buddy and I had only 11 rounds of ammo left between us. We had not eaten in 2 days. The final attack occurred late in the afternoon when white parka-clad German infantry made a bayonet charge into our lines, tossing hand grenades into our foxholes. After exhausting our final ammo, we jumped out of our foxhole, hoping to prevent them from throwing a grenade in on us. I saw a German heading straight for me, yelling, "Raus mit der Hans, raus mit der Hans." My body was frozen in fear, and I could not get my hands up. He jabbed at me with his bayonet, and it hit the button on my field jacket and sliced my jacket's left shoulder. He retracted and was going to stick me again when I was able to get my hands up. And that is when my status changed from combat infantryman to a prisoner of war. Every former POW that I have encountered has told a different story of his capture and subsequent treatment. However, they all report the feeling of humiliation and shock. The most asked question of an ex-POW is, what was it like? Well, allow me to summarize an answer reflecting only on my prison experience. The first is hunger. The hunger that is forced on you from the lack of solid food for months on end. The hunger that will force you to eat anything and everything that is available. The second is being cold. A cold that wrecks your body in uncontrollable shivering and causes your mind to become dull. Fear, a nameless terror that takes control of your body and mind. A fear where you lose control of your body functions as bombs fall on you in a locked boxcar. Fear of catching a horrible disease that is running rampant in the camp, and you know there are no medications or medical personnel that can help you. And the worst fear, of course, is never again being free and seeing your loved ones. Depression is a fourth effect on the mind. Thoughts of family and home lock your mind in endless daydreams, wondering and worrying if they know you're alive. And this perhaps is one of the cruelest of tortures. Then there's another question that's always asked of me. I'm Jewish. Did they know? Well, as to the answer, if they knew, the answer is yes and no. And yes, they knew, and no, I didn't know they knew. Let me explain. When I was first captured, my interrogator, a graduate of Penn State University, and he spoke perfect English, asked me my religion. I replied atheist, because I had destroyed my dog tags just prior to being captured. Why? Because our dog tags had our religion stamped on it, and mine had an H for Hebrew. During World War II, all faiths had their religion stamped on their dog tags for the chaplain's use in the event of our death. I left it at that, thinking I had fooled them. It was only later, after my liberation by the Russians, I found my prison record, and I discovered I hadn't fooled anyone, as it was plainly stamped across the face of my record, Jew. After being captured, I was forced marched for 3 days on frozen feet, no food or water, made to lie down in the snow in frozen fields at night with no shelter, and only my field jacket as my outer covering, and the temperature never getting above freezing. On the 4th day, about 40 miles east of where I was captured, I was packed with 65 other GIs into a boxcar, which would normally hold 40 men. Our car had previously contained horses, and their manure was still covering the thin layer of straw on the floor. We were so tight that it was impossible to sit down. On Christmas Eve, our train was in a rail yard and the IRF bombed us. Many cars were destroyed, with many casualties. Others unlocked my boxcar, and we all sought shelter on the embankments. After the raid, we were forced back onto the train, tighter than before. And this boxcar was my home for the next 7 days. As the wounded died, we stacked them erect in a corner like cordwood, which gave us a little bit more room. We had no food or water for the first 3 days, and many became delirious. Then we were allowed to pass our helmets out for water and a loaf of black bread for 8 men. Of course, you know what our helmets have been used for during that time. So all of us came down with dysentery, which made the situation even worse. In the next 10 days, I was transported to 2 different prison camps, each further east. The last was on the Oder River on the Polish border. I was just getting settled into an old German army camp when the Russians started their winter offensive, and the Germans forced us to vacate the camp. And it was only many years later I learned that we were to be used as bargaining chips. All this time, I was fighting the effects of frozen feet with no medication or medical help, and due to the swelling, I was unable to wear my combat boots. But with the help of another GI who donated part of his overcoat, I made booties to wrap around my feet and was able to shuffle and hobble along on the icy roads with 5,000 American POWs on a 110-mile forced march, with the temperature barely getting above zero. As we shuffled along through the villages, the children would throw stones, sick their dogs on us, women would pour water on us from the 2nd story to add to our misery. Any defensive action that we would take would result in being bayoneted or shot. Many of my fellow POWs did not complete that march. During those 10 days, we slept in open fields at night, huddled together in each other's arms to keep from freezing to death, and guarded by vicious German Shepherd and Doberman dogs. Some nights, when conditions permitted, we crawled around and found the animal dung mounds and dug up potatoes and turnips that the farmers had buried for the winter. We scrubbed them on our clothing to be able to eat them raw. For water, we scooped up snow and melted it in our mouths. To this day, I cannot eat the skin of a potato. Upon arrival at our new camp just south of Berlin, we were issued 2 thin blankets, housed in circus tents, which had 2 inches of straw, no heat, and each held about 500 men. And this was my home during the rest of the winter, until I was liberated by the Russians in the late spring of 1945. Our daily rations consisted of a cup of colored water in the morning, a thin soup, and if lucky, sometimes a piece of wild boar with the skin and fur still on it for lunch, followed by another cup of hot water for dinner. Every 3 days, a 1-pound loaf of black bread made with 50% sawdust was issued to 5 men to supplement our diet. Every 3 or 4 weeks, a Red Cross parcel was issued to 5 men to share, consisting of a half pound can of powdered milk, a spoon of jam, 4 crackers, a small wedge of cheese, a 3-ounce can of meat spread, and 5 cigarettes. There was 1 water hose connection in our American compound, and the men would line up all day to get a cup of water for personal hygiene. As mentioned, this was an American compound, as each nationality was separated by huge fences. There were a total of 7 compounds in this camp, with a total of about 60,000 prisoners. One day in April, all American prisoners were forced to line up in front of our tents in column of 5s. The Germans then ordered all Jews to step forward. Immediately, a whispered command was passed through the ranks. No one stepped forward. The Germans went crazy, threatening to shoot everyone. After an hour or so of this ranting by the Germans, it looked like they were going to shoot people, so another whispered command went through the ranks. Everyone stepped forward. Well, of course, this made the Germans even more violent, and we were forced to stand out in the rain all day without our meager rations. This was my only experience for being a Jew, but was the formation of a bond of friendship formed behind enemy barbed wire that exists to this day. Why the Germans never looked at my prison record, only the good Lord knows. Approximately a week after this incident, we were again forced out in front of our tents. However, this time we noticed that there were extra guards and machine guns had been placed in the guard towers. The German officers were arguing amongst themselves for many hours. Nobody knew what was happening. It was years later I learned and verified by the International Red Cross that Hitler had ordered all American prisoners to be shot that day. On the morning of April 22nd, we heard artillery and gunfire not far away. We had no idea whose it was, but a big Sherman tank came down alongside the fence, made a sharp right turn and flattened the fence, and when the turret opened, a large furry black hat emerged with a toothless face and exclaimed, "Ruski." Well, you can imagine the pandemonium that erupted through the camp as the realization set in that we were freed. After the Russians liberated us, they indicated we Americans would be sent back to U.S. military control by way of Odessa on the Black Sea, some 1,500 miles to the east, even though we learned through our crystal radio sets that the American Army was 100 miles away to the west at the Elbe River. For the next 2 weeks, they made no attempt to contact the Americans. The Russians were not too kind to us, and of course worse to the German population. We had to forage for our own food, and you can imagine the chaos with over 60,000 men of all nationalities from the prison camp running amok through the villages and farms looking for food. I among them, raiding farmhouses, catching chickens, killed them on the spot. We cooked them on open fires, and then we tried to eat them. We discovered our stomachs had shrunk so that we could not digest any solid food. After 2 weeks with the Russians not making any attempt to contact Americans, I joined 6 other American GIs. We armed ourselves with some weapons some friendly Russians gave us, and we set out to find the American lines. We made our way through the German and Russian lines, traveling at night, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings for about 100 miles. And we finally found the Americans on the west side of the Elbe River on the day that Germany surrendered, May 8th, 1945. And to this day, I like to think that they surrendered when they heard I had rejoined the American Army. My return to American military control did not go smoothly. You can imagine how we looked. I was in the same uniform I had been captured in. Heavy beards, long hair, way before it became fashionable, and looked just like the thousands of refugees jamming the roads, trying to get away from the Russians. Only we had weapons. We spotted an American truck some 500 yards ahead of us. We fired our weapons into the air to attract their attention. They stopped, turned their .50 caliber machine gun on us, and fired a couple of bursts, thankfully not hitting us. We screamed that we were American POWs, and they ordered me, the most forward one, to come forward and identify myself. I was asked my hometown, replied Gary, Indiana. Then he asked what high school I went to, which I thought was strange. But upon answering Lew Wallace High, he said the most beautiful words I have ever heard. "Come on in, soldier. Your high school beat my high school for this year's Indiana State Basketball Championship." And it was at that moment that my designator changed from prisoner of war to a GI once again.